Somewhere beneath your feet, in the emptiest quarter of the emptiest desert on Earth, there is a number the world spent 80 years trying to guess. Satellites have mapped every dune. Surveyors have crossed it on foot, on camel, in trucks built to survive temperatures past 50 degrees Celsius. And still, for decades, the country sitting on top of it all refused to say exactly how much wealth was buried down there. Not because it didn't know, because knowing and staying silent was its own kind of power. This is a place that learned, before almost anywhere else on the planet, that what you don't show the world is worth more than what you do. That lesson built a kingdom. It also nearly buried one journalist, thousands of migrant laborers, and, in the spring of 2026, very nearly the country itself. Say Saudi Arabia, and most people picture two things: oil and a black cube surrounded by a sea of white-robed pilgrims. Both images are real. Neither is the whole picture, and that gap between what is shown and what is kept is the story itself. This is a nation that has spent over a century deciding, with total control, exactly what outsiders get to see, which cities you may enter, which numbers you may know, which workers you may hear from, which secrets get buried in the sand, until someone with a shovel, a satellite, or a conscience digs them up anyway. Every civilization keeps some things hidden. Few have made hiddenness itself into a form of statecraft. The numbers, where they exist, are almost absurd. Saudi Arabia holds an estimated 267 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the second largest stockpile on the planet, enough, at current extraction rates, to keep pumping for well over half a century. It covers more than 2.1 million square kilometers, an area larger than France, Germany, and Spain combined. Much of it desert so total that entire regions remain, even now, among the least surveyed places on Earth. More than 34 million people live inside its borders. Since 2016, its government has committed over $1.25 trillion to reinvent itself before the oil eventually runs out. The most expensive peacetime economic transformation attempted by any nation in modern history. And at the center of nearly every chapter of that transformation sits one recurring pattern, a secret kept until it simply couldn't be anymore. It is also, by any measure, one of the most consequential single actors in global energy markets. A founding architect of OPEC+, capable of moving crude prices worldwide with a single production announcement, and, as of 2025, the world's fifth largest military spender, committing $78 billion to defense in a single year. None of that scale is new. What has changed over the past decade is how much of it the kingdom has started, however cautiously, to let the rest of the world actually see. Start where the secrets start, in the sand itself, in a stretch of desert so vast and so empty that the people who live near it simply call it the empty quarter. It covers 650,000 square kilometers of southern Arabia, an area larger than France, and roughly 4/5 of it sits inside Saudi Arabia's own borders. Dunes here rise as high as 250 meters, their faces glowing a deep reddish orange from iron oxide in the sand, shifting shape with every seasonal wind. Daytime temperatures in summer climb past 50 degrees Celsius. Annual rainfall, in most years, stays under 30 millimeters. Bertram Thomas became the first Westerner to cross it in 1931. British explorer Wilfred Thesiger spent years living alongside the Bedouin who called it home, later chronicling their vanishing way of life in a book called Arabian Sands. Even now, guided expeditions describe losing mobile signal within an hour of leaving the last paved road. Bedouin legend places a lost city called Ubar or Iram somewhere beneath these dunes, a city the Quran itself describes as destroyed for the arrogance of its people, later nicknamed by Western writers the Atlantis of the Sands. Satellite imagery in the 1990s revealed traces of an ancient settlement near a site called Shisr, just across the border in Oman, that some archaeologists believe may be connected to the legend. Whether or not Ubar was ever real, the desert has produced stranger things. Scientists have pulled fossils of hippopotamus and water buffalo out from beneath the dunes, proof that lakes and grassland once covered ground that has not seen standing water in thousands of years. The emptiness, it turns out, was never actually empty. It was simply unread. For thousands of years before anyone thought to drill anything, the only people who called this desert home were tribes like the Al-Murra, who raised camels along its margins and passed down, generation to generation, the location of a handful of hidden wells that made survival possible at all. Frankincense caravans once cut straight through the desert's interior, carrying resin from southern Arabia to Mediterranean markets, until worsening desertification made the crossing too dangerous to attempt after roughly 300 AD. The routes fell out of use. The knowledge of exactly where they had run disappeared not long after. One of the desert's smaller, quieter secrets lost the ordinary way. Nobody left to remember it. In 1948, geologists drilling in the northeastern corner of this same desert struck something that would make every earlier discovery look small. They named it Ghawar, the largest conventional oil field ever found on Earth, stretching 260 kilometers north to south, holding an estimated 48 billion barrels of recoverable reserves beneath sand that Bedouin tribes had crossed on camelback for centuries without ever suspecting what lay beneath their feet. To this day, Ghawar and 3 other fields together account for nearly 70% of the kingdom's total oil production. The world's largest secret, it turned out, had been sitting under one of the world's most thoroughly ignored deserts the entire time. So who actually claimed all of this first? And how did a stateless exile with 40 men manage to build a kingdom large enough to sit on top of it? The story the kingdom tells about its own birth begins on a January night in 1902, and it begins with a plan built entirely on secrecy. Abdulaziz bin Abdul Rahman Al Saud, the world would later know him as Ibn Saud, was in his 20s and living in exile in Kuwait, the last surviving claim of a dynasty that had already lost everything twice before. His family's old capital, Riyadh, belonged to a rival clan, the Rashidis, and sat guarded inside a mud-brick fortress called Masmak. Ibn Saud borrowed horses, borrowed men, and rode back into the Nejd with a single idea: slip into the city under cover of darkness, hide inside the houses facing the fortress, and wait for morning, when the Rashidi governor stepped outside the gate as he always did, every day, without fail. At dawn, on January 15th, Ibn Saud's men scaled the fort's walls using tilted palm trunks propped against the mud brick. They took the governor the moment he opened that gate. By the time the sun was fully up, Riyadh belonged to the House of Saud again, and nobody outside the city had known the attack was coming until it was already finished. It is the founding image the kingdom still tells about itself. Not a battle won through numbers, but a secret kept just long enough to win. It took him 3 more decades and a religious militia called the Ikhwan to finish the job. Al-Hassa was taken from the Ottomans in 1913, restoring Arab rule to the Gulf Coast after more than 40 years of foreign administration. The Nejd was fully secured by the early 1920s. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina were folded into his territory by 1925, after the Hashemite rulers, who had governed them for centuries, were driven out. On September 23, 1932, Ibn Saud stood before his advisors in Riyadh and proclaimed the union of Nejd and Hijaz into a single state, named, with a bluntness rare in the history of nations, after his own family, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, not a place, a possession. Historians still argue over the true human cost of those 3 decades. Some older estimates for total casualties across the unification wars run into the hundreds of thousands. More recent scholarship calls those figures exaggerated, built on unreliable second-hand reporting rather than verified records. What is not disputed is the scale of what was stitched together. 4 historically distinct regions, Hijaz, Nejd, Al-Hassa, and Asir, each with its own dialect, its own tribal loyalties, its own centuries of separate history, folded by force and negotiation into a single flag inside 30 years. Here is the detail almost nobody remembers. That very same year, geologists working under a concession deal signed with an American oil company were already sinking test wells into the sand 200 kilometers to the east. The founding of the state and the beginning of the search for what lay beneath it happened, essentially, inside the same 12 months. The kingdom and its secret were born together, and for the better part of the following century, neither one would ever fully belong to anyone outside the House of Saud. If the ground beneath Ibn Saud's new kingdom held something worth having, how long could anyone actually keep something that size hidden from the rest of the world? The answer took 6 more years, 6 failed wells, and one man whose name almost nobody outside Saudi Arabia has ever heard. His name was Khamis bin Rimthan, a tracker from the Ajman tribe who had spent his whole life reading the Eastern Province the way other men read books. By the color of the soil, the angle of a dune's shadow at a given hour, the folk memory of where water had once pooled and vanished centuries before. American geologists arrived in 1933 with instruments, theodolites, survey techniques translated from oil fields half a world away. None of it meant much in a landscape with no rivers, no mountains, no fixed points of any kind. Rimthan meant everything. He guided the drilling teams from site to site using nothing but instinct built over decades. And in 1935, he led them to a low rise the geologists would come to call Dammam. The first 6 wells there disappointed everyone involved. Well number 7 nearly did too. Cave-ins, stuck drill bits, a blowout on the final day of 1937 that emptied the whole of everything it held. Chief geologist Max Steinecke ordered his crews to keep drilling anyway, deeper than any previous well on the peninsula, past the point where shareholders back in California had started asking hard questions about when this would ever pay for itself. On March 3, 1938, at a depth of 1,440 meters, oil began to flow. By the end of that month, it was producing over 3,800 barrels a day. They would later call it the Prosperity Well. Here is the part worth sitting with. Rimthan found the kingdom's secret using nothing but his own senses, in a place no instrument could fully read on its own. He died in 1959, and in 1974 Aramco quietly named an oil field after him, a tribute buried in company history most of the world never sees. In 2021, more than 60 years after his death, Aramco unveiled a new supercomputer, one of the 10 most powerful machines on the planet, built to model oil reservoirs no human eye could ever survey unassisted. They named it Dammam 7. A man who read the desert's secrets with nothing but instinct now lends his name to a machine that reads them with mathematics he never lived to see invented. Hold on to that image. It comes back before the end of this story. By October 1938, the field was confirmed as commercially viable, and everything about the Arabian Peninsula changed at once. What Ibn Saud had unified through force, oil would go on to unify through money, and for most of the decades that followed, the exact size of what sat beneath the sand remained one of the most closely guarded numbers on Earth. Saudi Arabia treated its own reserves data as a state secret from at least the early 1980s onward, refusing outside audits, even as speculation swirled that the true figures might be wildly inflated or deliberately understated. Not until 2019, ahead of Aramco's public stock offering, did the kingdom finally allow an independent American firm, Ghawar and McNaughton, to audit the number for the first time in its history. The audit came back close to what officials had always claimed. The world had simply never been permitted to check. The company built on that secret is now almost incomprehensibly large. Saudi Aramco produced roughly 12.9 million barrels of oil equivalent a day in 2025, employs more than 76,000 people across more than 80 nationalities, and carried a market capitalization of nearly $1.8 trillion as of mid-2026, the 8th most valuable company on the planet. Chief Executive Amin Nasser has described the results as proof of what he calls robust growth and strong cash flows, even as rivals like ExxonMobil and Shell posted far steeper earnings declines the same year. In the first quarter of 2026 alone, as war disrupted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, Aramco rerouted crude through an overland pipeline running at full capacity to the Red Sea, simply to keep the exports flowing. A company built on a secret the state once refused to confirm now moves enough oil, on any given day, to change the price of nearly everything on Earth. Beside Aramco sits the Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth vehicle, actually spending the kingdom's oil money on everything from professional golf to a brand new national airline. Riyadh Air, launched in 2023 and yet to fly its first commercial passenger as of this recording, has already opened an all-female aircraft engineering training program. Its inaugural class of 27 women selected from thousands of applicants. The fund's assets crossed $1 trillion in mid-2025, ahead of its own internal targets, with a formal goal of reaching $2.67 trillion by 2030. It is, in effect, the mechanism by which one secret, buried oil, is meant to slowly become another kind of wealth entirely, one that does not run out. If the kingdom could keep the ground itself a secret for the better part of 40 years, what else has it decided the rest of the world isn't allowed to see? Fly toward the western coast of Saudi Arabia, and you will eventually reach a checkpoint that no visa, no passport, no amount of money can get you past, unless you can prove, at the roadside, that you are Muslim. Mecca is the only major city on Earth that is, by law, entirely closed to non-adherents of a single religion. The restriction traces to a line in the Quran instructing that unbelievers should not approach the sacred mosque, and Saudi authorities enforce it with a seriousness bordering on the absolute. Face recognition checkpoints on every road leading in, questions about basic Islamic practice for anyone claiming to have converted, fines that can run into the thousands of dollars, and deportation, sometimes a lifetime ban, for anyone caught inside without the right to be there. Medina is gentler but still guarded. Non-Muslims may walk its streets freely, but the Prophet's mosque itself remains sealed to them, fenced and signposted at its edges for anyone approaching from outside the faith. For those permitted inside, the scene at the center of it all is almost impossible to describe secondhand. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims in simple white cloth circling the Kaaba counterclockwise, 7 times, a slow human tide moving around a single black cube at the heart of the Grand Mosque, chanting the same prayer in dozens of languages at once. It is one of the largest peaceful gatherings of human beings anywhere on the planet, repeated every year, almost entirely undocumented by outside cameras. Each year, the restriction meets its hardest test during Hajj, when roughly 1.5 million Muslims converge on Mecca inside a matter of days, retracing a path first walked some 14 centuries earlier. In 2025 alone, Saudi authorities turned away 269,678 pilgrims who arrived without a permit. A crackdown born less from bureaucracy than from grief. More than 1,300 pilgrims had died from extreme heat during the previous year's pilgrimage, many of them undocumented worshippers who had slipped past checkpoints to fulfill an obligation they otherwise could not afford. The kingdom answered with tighter fences, more biometric scanners, a new ban on children under 12, and fines up to 20,000 rials for anyone caught attempting the same crossing twice. Lieutenant General Mohammed Al-Omari, addressing reporters in Mecca as the crackdown unfolded, put the new posture bluntly: "The pilgrim is in our sight, and anyone who disobeys is in our hands." The economics of getting there are their own kind of filter. A Hajj package can run anywhere from $4,000 to $20,000, depending on comfort level and country of departure, and nations are allocated quotas roughly proportional to their Muslim population, about 1,000 pilgrims per million believers. Indonesia sends the most every year, followed by Pakistan and India. For a great many Muslims worldwide, the wait for a permitted slot can stretch into years, sometimes decades, before this one journey, obligatory but not guaranteed, actually becomes possible. The secrecy around Mecca is not new, and it has not always stayed peaceful. In November 1979, a group of armed militants, led by a man named Juhayman al-Otaibi, a descendant of fighters crushed decades earlier during Ibn Saud's own consolidation of power, seized the Grand Mosque itself, took hundreds of pilgrims hostage inside the most sacred structure in Islam, and held it for 2 weeks before Saudi and French special forces retook it by force. The kingdom's response afterward was not to open the city further, but to close the entire country tighter for a generation. Stricter religious enforcement, deeper alliance with conservative clerics, a chill on public life that would take decades to thaw. A closed city, breached once, became more closed still, and the closing did not stop at the city limits. The religious current running underneath all of this traces back further than the kingdom itself, to a pact struck in 1744 between a tribal chief named Muhammad bin Saud and a preacher named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who called for a strict, literalist return to early Islamic practice. Wahhab's religious descendants would go on to control education, public morality enforcement, and the fatwas governing daily life for the next 2.5 centuries, in exchange for their endorsement of the Al Saud family's political rule. For most of the 20th century, That arrangement was the actual machinery running underneath the kingdom's public face. A state built on oil wealth, policed in its private and public life by clerics whose authority the ruling family needed and, in turn, protected. 200 kilometers south of Riyadh, in a reserve called Mahazat as-Said, a species that once vanished entirely from the wild now numbers in the hundreds. The Arabian oryx, a white antelope with horns so straight that some scholars believe it inspired the unicorn myth, was hunted to extinction in its natural range by 1972. Conservationists rebuilt the entire wild population from just 9 captive animals, most of them donated from private collections and zoos scattered across the world. Today, more than 1,200 oryx roam free across Saudi Arabia and the wider peninsula, grazing at dawn on scrubland so quiet you can hear their hooves against the gravel from 50 meters away. It is one of the only stories in this stretch of desert with an uncomplicated happy ending, brought back from nothing by patient, unglamorous work. Conservationists have set an even harder target for the decade ahead, reintroducing the Arabian leopard, a subspecies down to perhaps 200 individuals across the entire peninsula, into the mountains above Al-Diula before this decade is out. If a nearly extinct antelope could be brought back into the light after 50 years hidden from view, what happens when the thing kept hidden is not an animal, but half the population? For most of the kingdom's modern history, a Saudi woman's legal existence ran through a man, not metaphorically, literally. Under a system called wilaya, guardianship, a woman needed her father's, husband's, brother's, or sometimes even her own adult son's, written permission to obtain a passport, travel abroad, or marry. Human Rights Watch would later call it the single greatest impediment to women's rights in the entire country. For decades, the system was simply how things worked, largely invisible to outsiders, because the women living inside it had almost no platform from which to describe it to anyone beyond their own front door. The year is 2017. King Salman issues a decree instructing government offices to stop demanding guardian permission for services where no actual law required it. A small, almost bureaucratic admission that the system had, for years, been enforced well beyond what was ever written down. Weeks later, a second decree lifts the ban on women driving, ending a restriction that had made Saudi Arabia the last country on earth where it was illegal for a woman to get behind the wheel. Within the same wave of reforms, women are permitted into sports stadiums for the first time in the kingdom's history, and non-combat military roles open to female recruits in 2018. By 2020, women serve in combat positions across every branch of the armed forces. Iman al-Hussein, a Gulf policy analyst who had tracked the system for years, called the announcements that followed perhaps the boldest decisions taken so far under the country's current leadership on the situation of women in the kingdom. The year is 2019. New regulations allow Saudi women over 21 to obtain a passport and travel abroad without asking anyone's permission at all, the single largest crack yet in a system built, from the start, to require one. Female labor force participation, sitting at roughly 20% when the reforms began, would climb past 35% by 2024, blowing past the government's own Vision 2030 target 6 years ahead of schedule. In February 2025, the kingdom published further regulations restricting a guardian's role in marriage disputes, granting women the right to request a transfer of guardianship if a male relative acts unjustly or negligently. By 2024, the country had its first female-led sports federations, 7 of them, overseeing more than 50,000 registered female athletes, and its first cohorts of women admitted to study law. None of it looked like the Saudi Arabia most of the world had spent decades picturing. None of it came without cost, and none of it erased the system entirely. Guardians still retain a legal role in marriage and in a woman's release from prison or a shelter. Lujain al-Hathlul, one of the activists who had campaigned for the right to drive years before it was granted, was imprisoned during the very period the reforms were being announced to the outside world. Manahel al-Otaibi, another women's rights advocate, remains imprisoned on terrorism-related charges tied to her activism as of this recording. The kingdom that opened the roads to women kept the activists who had demanded them behind locked doors. Both things are true at once. Neither one cancels the other out. The desert doesn't give up its secrets, it decides who gets to keep them. And if the state could decide, decree by decree, exactly how much freedom to release and exactly how much dissent to keep buried, who was actually making those decisions, and what was he building toward? For 60-plus years after Ibn Saud's death in 1953, the throne passed exclusively among his own sons, one aging brother succeeding another in a system built for stability but running, by the 2010s, out of eligible brothers. Mohammed bin Salman's rise represented something the kingdom had never done before, skipping an entire generation to hand power directly to a grandson, while his own father, King Salman, remained alive and formally on the throne. On November 4, 2017, several hundred of the most powerful men in Saudi Arabia, princes, ministers, billionaires, were summoned to the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh and did not leave for months. Officially, it was an anti-corruption sweep, ordered by a 32-year-old crown prince named Mohammed bin Salman, who had been elevated to heir apparent just 5 months earlier, skipping over an older, more established cousin in the line of succession. Unofficially, analysts inside and outside the kingdom read it much the same way, a purge, dressed as reform, that eliminated rival power centers in a single move and left one man holding nearly all the strings of the state at once. That man had already, a year earlier, unveiled the most expensive economic transformation plan any government has attempted in peacetime. Vision 2030, launched in April 2016, promised to wean Saudi Arabia off the oil dependency that had built it, inside a single generation, using state investment on a scale with almost no real precedent outside post-war reconstruction. The plan set specific, almost aggressive targets: raise women's workforce participation, welcome 100 million annual visitors, cut unemployment from over 12% into single digits, generate more than half of GDP from sectors that had nothing to do with oil at all. It was, in essence, a plan to make the kingdom's greatest secret its dependency on a resource that would not last forever, a little less true with each passing year. The plan existed because the alternative had already been tried and had failed. Brent crude collapsed from $115 a barrel in June 2014 to under $30 by January 2016, exposing a government whose budget still depended on oil for roughly 90% of its revenue. Foreign reserves were draining by more than $10 billion a month. The budget deficit hit 15% of GDP that year. Riyadh had weathered oil crashes before, simply by cutting spending and waiting for prices to recover. This time, the plan was to make sure it never had to wait again. A decade later, the record is neither the triumph the government's own messaging suggests, nor the failure critics sometimes claim. Unemployment among Saudi citizens really did fall, from 12.3% to roughly 7%, a target hit 6 years ahead of schedule. Non-oil activity really does now account for 52% of GDP, with non-oil government revenue hitting a record 505.3 billion riyals in 2025. The 100 million visitor target was hit early, and yet foreign direct investment sits at barely a third of what the plan called for, and the kingdom's break-even oil price, the price crude must hold for the state budget to balance, sits above $90 a barrel, well over what oil has actually traded for through most of this period. Ambition and delivery, running on two very different clocks. Drive into Riyadh today, and the change is impossible to miss from any angle. A city of roughly 400,000 people when Ibn Saud died in 1953 now holds more than 7 million. Its skyline dominated by structures unthinkable a generation ago. The Kingdom Center Tower, its inverted arch cutting into the haze at 302 meters, the glass canyons of the King Abdullah Financial District, cranes suspended over the beginnings of what will eventually become the Muqab. Before construction, there was quietly paused. Traffic moves along an elevated metro system that did not exist a decade ago, ferrying commuters past billboards, advertising concerts that would have been unimaginable, let alone advertised in public, 20 years earlier. 600 kilometers west, in Jeddah's old quarter of Al-Balad, coral stone merchant houses with elaborately carved wooden balconies, a building style found nowhere else on Earth, stand a short walk from the Red Sea, the same port that funneled pilgrims toward Mecca for over 1,000 years before airports existed. UNESCO listed the district as a World Heritage Site in 2014. Restoration work, slow and chronically underfunded compared to the newer giga-projects further north, continues largely out of the international spotlight, in a corner of the country nobody flies in specifically to see. Some of what the plan changed had nothing to do with money at all, and almost everything to do with what Saudis were finally permitted to watch, hear, and see in public. In 1980, in the anxious aftermath of the Grand Mosque siege, the kingdom shut down every movie theater on its territory, a ban that would last 35 years. Saudis who wanted to see a film crossed into Bahrain or the UAE instead, sometimes flying 2.5 hours each way simply to watch a movie and fly home again the same night. On April 18, 2018, the first public cinema in the kingdom in a generation opened in Riyadh's King Abdullah Financial District, in a hall originally built to host a symphony orchestra. The first film shown was Black Panther. Actor John Travolta, flown in for the occasion, called it a celebration of freedom connected, in his words, to a beautiful thing in humanity. The government's own target is 350 theaters and roughly 2,000 screens by 2030. Box office revenue reached $238 million in 2021 alone, more than double the year before. Concerts, comedy shows, and mixed-gender sporting events, all effectively banned for a generation, returned within the same handful of years. The Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, the country's most senior religious authority, warned publicly that cinemas would invite what he called the mixing of sexes and the broadcast of shameless, atheistic films. The government opened them anyway. A secret this time was not a number or a location. It was simply an entire generation's ordinary evenings, hidden behind a religious ban for 35 years, and then, almost overnight, given back. By the early 2020s, an electronic music festival called MDL Beast Soundstorm was drawing crowds in the hundreds of thousands to the outskirts of Riyadh for a weekend of performances that, a decade earlier, would have been unimaginable inside the kingdom's borders, let alone government-sponsored. International DJs who once refused invitations over human rights concerns increasingly accepted them anyway. Drawn by fees few festivals elsewhere could match. Critics called it sports washing and culture washing in equal measure. Government money buying a friendlier global image, one headline performer at a time. The government called it exactly what Vision 2030 had promised from the start: entertainment, finally, as an industry rather than a crime. Nowhere would the gap between what Vision 2030 promised and what it could actually deliver become more visible than in the deserts north of Mecca, where the kingdom decided to build something that had never existed anywhere on Earth before, and where a much older secret was about to be pulled back out of the very same sand. 400 kilometers north of Medina, in a valley called Al-Lula, sit more than 100 tombs carved directly into sandstone cliffs, facades cut with columns and pediments and guardian eagles, inscriptions written in a script that would later evolve into written Arabic itself. This is Hegra, the second city of the ancient Nabatean kingdom, sister site to Jordan's famous Petra, and for nearly 2,000 years, almost nobody outside a handful of Bedouin tribes and passing traders knew for certain it was even there. Laila Neme, the French-Lebanese archaeologist who has led excavations at the site since 2002, put it simply: in over 20 years working there, she has said, she has never once been subject to censorship, a notable claim in a country not generally known for granting outside researchers that kind of freedom. Her team's work has uncovered a residential quarter of 50 hectares, a water network of more than 100 wells up to 7 meters wide, and, in 2008, a nearly complete skeleton inside one of the tombs, identified by its own 2,000-year-old inscription as a woman named Hinat, daughter of Wabu, who had commissioned the tomb for herself and her descendants. Researchers used forensic reconstruction to rebuild her face from the bones alone. Munira al-Mushah, a Saudi archaeologist who worked on the reconstruction, called Hinat's story of property ownership and self-determination actually very inspiring, in her own words, for herself and for other women within Saudi Arabia today. It is a strange kind of symmetry, a 2,000-year-old woman, buried and forgotten, becoming a small point of pride for women navigating an entirely different set of restrictions in the same valley. 2 millennia later, the country kept the site essentially closed to casual visitors until 2019, when the first tourist e-visas were introduced. Hegra now draws roughly 265,000 visitors a year, a fraction of the nearly 1 million who visit Petra annually. A few hundred kilometers north across a border most visitors will never cross to make the comparison for themselves. A recent survey identified some 30,000 potential archaeological sites across the broader Al-Lula region. Archaeologists estimate they have excavated perhaps 5% of it so far. Here, the pattern repeats at a scale older than oil, older than the kingdom itself, something enormous, buried in plain sight, kept from the world not by force this time, but simply by distance, by silence, by a closed border nobody thought to open until money made it worth opening at last. The kingdom has poured serious money into making sure the comparison with Petra eventually favors Al-Lula. Boutique resorts tucked into the sandstone, a mirrored concert hall named Mariah that appears to vanish into the cliffs around it, and a cave hotel designed by the French architect Jean Nouvel echoing the same rock-carving instinct the Nabateans themselves relied on 2,000 years earlier, still under construction as of this recording. Alula is not the only place the kingdom has quietly excavated for its own image. Diriyah, the ancestral home of the House of Saud just outside Riyadh, and the site of Ibn Saud's own ancestors' first fortified settlement, is being rebuilt as a $63 billion heritage and hospitality district, one of the few giga-projects that analysts tracking Vision 2030 describe as genuinely ahead of schedule. Where NEOM struggles to convince investors its numbers are real, Diriyah has already opened restaurants, museums, and hotel rooms inside walls the Saud family once called home. Long before any of this, the oil, the towers, the tombs existed at all. Not every secret the kingdom has built into the desert is 2,000 years old, and not every one of them has a happy ending waiting patiently to be excavated. In the far northwest corner of the country, along a stretch of Red Sea coastline roughly the size of Belgium, Saudi Arabia is attempting to build a city unlike anything constructed by human beings before. The Line, a single continuous structure originally planned to run 170 kilometers through the desert, 500 meters tall, 200 meters wide, meant to house 9 million people inside 2 mirrored walls with no cars, no roads, and no carbon emissions at all. It is the centerpiece of NEOM, a $500 billion giga project, and the single most visible physical symbol of everything Vision 2030 set out to prove about what the kingdom could still become. Renderings released by the project show a car-free vertical city with a mirrored exterior reflecting the desert around it, an artificial ski resort called Troyena carved into the mountains nearby, meant to host the 2029 Asian Winter Games in a country that rarely sees frost, and a private island called Sindala, opening for yacht tourists in the same stretch of coastline where migrant labor camps sit largely out of view. The scale of ambition is, by any measure, unlike anything else being attempted on the planet right now. None of it comes cheap, and not all of it is going according to the original plan. NEOM's own leadership has quietly acknowledged that the line's habitable length, once promised at a full 170 kilometers, will likely reach only a small fraction of that by any date currently on the table. Saudi officials have stopped publishing firm cost estimates for the project altogether, a silence some analysts read as its own kind of admission. It is also, according to multiple independent investigations, being built on the backs of migrant laborers working under conditions that international observers have described in stark terms. Saudi Arabia's migrant workforce grew by 40% to 13.2 million people in the 5 years leading into 2024, feeding not just NEOM, but the stadiums and hotels required for the 2034 FIFA World Cup. A 2024 Human Rights Watch investigation documented workers paid less than half their promised wage, charged over $1,000 in illegal recruitment fees they had no real way to challenge, and working days that stretched past 16 hours with little rest and, in workers' own accounts, no realistic path to leave once they had arrived. Saudi law technically caps the working week, including overtime, at 60 hours. Multiple worker accounts collected by rights investigators describe shifts stretching past 80 hours in practice, particularly during the crunch periods construction managers call, without apparent irony, a race against time. The deaths are harder to verify than the wages. A 2025 investigation by the human rights group Fair Square found systemic failures in how Saudi Arabia's medico-legal system certifies the deaths of foreign workers. Cases where hospital records describing tuberculosis, blood loss, and respiratory failure were overwritten by government paperwork listing simply natural death. One case researchers documented in detail. Badri Bujel, a 39-year-old machine operator on a NEOM tunnel project, vomited blood at work, was hospitalized, and died 5 days later, his official death certificate offering no more explanation than those 2 words. A British television documentary, drawing on cross-referenced consular and mortality data that Saudi authorities have not independently confirmed, reported an estimated 21,000 migrant worker deaths connected to Saudi construction projects since 2016, most of them workers from India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Not every family involved stays silent about it. When 25-year-old Pakistani engineer Abdul Wali Skandar Khan died after a guardrail collapsed on a NEOM site in December 2023, his brother Mir Wali Khan had to travel to Saudi Arabia at his own expense simply to recover the body. The companies involved and Saudi authorities, he told the human rights organization Al-Qist afterward, had treated his brother with callous disregard, failing at every stage since the death to act, and leaving his family with even more pain than the loss itself had already caused. The most futuristic city ever proposed is, by the account of the people physically building it, one of the least transparent workplaces on Earth, a secret hidden not in the ground this time, but behind a construction fence, 13 million workers deep. Off that same coastline, in waters most of the world has never heard of, the Red Sea shelters one of the healthiest coral reef systems left on the planet. More than 1,200 fish species and 200 species of coral thriving in water warmer than most reefs can survive, because these particular corals evolved through repeated ancient heat events that killed off their more fragile neighbors thousands of years ago. The nearby Farasan Islands hold the largest population of Arabian gazelle left anywhere in the wild, alongside whale sharks that pass through the strait each spring, entirely unbothered by any of what is being built on shore, a few hundred kilometers to the north. Some secrets stay buried by silence. Others get pulled into the light the moment someone with a hidden microphone decides they've had enough. On October 2, 2018, a 59-year-old Saudi journalist named Jamal Khashoggi walked into his own country's consulate in Istanbul to collect a document confirming his divorce so he could marry the Turkish fiancée waiting for him outside. Security cameras recorded him entering. No camera inside or outside the building ever recorded him leaving. Turkish investigators, working from recordings made inside a consulate they had secretly bugged, concluded that a 15-member Saudi team had been waiting for him. Khashoggi, a former insider turned critic of the Crown Prince's consolidation of power, was strangled and his body dismembered inside the building, in a room protected by diplomatic immunity belonging to the very government whose officials had just killed him. The CIA and several allied intelligence agencies concluded that Mohammed bin Salman himself had ordered the operation. Saudi officials initially denied any Saudi involvement at all, then insisted Khashoggi had simply left the building, then eventually acknowledged the killing while continuing to deny the Crown Prince had personal knowledge of it. The murder happened inside a diplomatic building, specifically because a diplomatic building offered something no ordinary crime scene could: legal inviolability, cleaners who could enter before investigators were allowed anywhere near it, walls that could be repainted before anyone with real authority was permitted to look. It was secrecy engineered directly into the architecture, and it very nearly worked completely. What broke it open was not international pressure or Saudi transparency. It was one foreign government's audio recordings made without permission, of a killing that was never supposed to have a soundtrack at all. The fallout reached further than Saudi officials likely expected. Major business leaders and media companies pulled out of the kingdom's flagship investment conference within weeks. A CIA assessment naming the Crown Prince directly was later confirmed publicly by the Biden administration in 2021, even as the two governments continued cooperating on security and oil policy in the years that followed. A murder, engineered to disappear without a trace, instead became one of the most thoroughly documented state killings of the 21st century. If a government could keep the details of a journalist's murder concealed inside its own walls, what happens when the threat comes from entirely outside those walls? When the secret the kingdom most needs to keep is simply how exposed it actually is. To understand why a war between two other countries could so thoroughly rattle Saudi Arabia, you have to understand what Iran has represented to Riyadh for nearly half a century, the other major power in the Gulf, a Shia theocracy at odds with the Al Saud family's role as guardians of Islam's holiest sites, and the backer of armed groups, from Lebanon's Hezbollah to Yemen's Houthi movement, that have struck Saudi territory directly more than once. Saudi Arabia had itself been fighting a grinding, internationally criticized war against Houthi forces in Yemen for the better part of a decade by the time tensions with Iran boiled over into outright war in 2026. The year is 2019. Drones and cruise missiles, launched from a direction Saudi officials never fully specified in public, strike the Abqaiq and Quraiz oil processing facilities, the beating heart of the kingdom's entire production capacity, knocking out roughly half of Saudi Arabia's oil output overnight. The attack is a warning about exactly how exposed the kingdom's most valuable secret really is. Sprawling, visible from orbit, and almost impossible to fully defend, no matter how much money sits behind it. The year is 2026. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran, opening a war that would draw in nearly every country along the Persian Gulf. Within days, Iranian missiles and drones are striking targets across Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia itself. Explosions are reported in eastern Riyadh. Saudi air defenses intercept missiles aimed at Prince Sultan Air Base and Riyadh's own airport. A drone strikes the Ras Tanura refinery. Iranian missiles damage American refueling aircraft stationed on Saudi soil. And in the days that follow, American service members die of injuries sustained in the attack, among the first US combat deaths on Saudi territory in the modern era. Reports later surfaced, via the Washington Post and the New York Times, that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had personally lobbied President Trump to launch the strikes on Iran, and later to keep the campaign going until the Iranian government fell entirely. Saudi officials denied both reports. What is not disputed is what happened next. Commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the channel through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil normally passes, dropped by more than 90% within days of the first strikes, forcing tankers onto longer, costlier routes and rippling into fuel shortages as far away as South and East Asia. Saudi Arabia, despite insisting publicly it wanted no part of the war, absorbed missile strikes anyway, restarted the Ras Tanura refinery within days of the first attack, only to have it hit a second time, and watched a Saudi Aramco helicopter crash at that same airport in March, killing all 14 Saudi nationals aboard. A ceasefire, brokered through months of diplomacy and formalized in what became known as the Islamabad Memorandum, quieted the fighting by early summer, but not before the war had done to Vision 2030 exactly what the 2019 Abqaiq strike had threatened 8 years earlier, only at a far larger scale. The kingdom's own sovereign wealth fund shifted focus toward defense manufacturing, alternative energy, and logistics, and away from some of its most extravagant giga projects. Formula One cancelled the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix outright. Saudi authorities began quietly unwinding the Crown Prince's international golf venture and sold off the majority of the country's most prized football club, redirecting the money elsewhere. The secret the kingdom had spent a decade trying to keep, that even 267 billion barrels of oil and $1 trillion sovereign fund cannot fully insulate a country wedged between hostile neighbors, was, for a few months in 2026, impossible to hide from anyone at all. The desert doesn't give up its secrets. It decides who gets to keep them. In the spring of 2026, for once, it simply wasn't the kingdom's decision to make. So after a war it didn't choose, a murder it couldn't hide, and a transformation plan built on numbers that don't all quite add up, what is Saudi Arabia's largest secret actually turning out to be? By early 2026, 10 years into Vision 2030, the kingdom's own performance auditors reported that 93% of tracked indicators were at or near target, a number the government's messaging leans on heavily whenever the plan comes under scrutiny. Look past the headline, and the picture gets more complicated. Of 1,290 individual initiatives launched under the plan, only 225 have been fully completed. 130 have been flagged for restructuring outright. The Line, once envisioned as a 170-kilometer glass city housing 9 million people, had its construction quietly halted in May 2026. The Muqab, a kilometer-tall cube planned for central Riyadh, was suspended that January. New Murabba, another flagship project, has been pushed back to 2040. 6 years past the original 2030 deadline, the entire program is named for. Set against that, unemployment genuinely fell. Women's workforce participation genuinely tripled. Non-oil revenue genuinely hit record highs. Saudi Arabia genuinely won the right to host the 2034 World Cup and the 2030 World Expo. Hard external deadlines, the kingdom cannot quietly push back the way it has pushed back so many of its own internal ones. The honest accounting, according to analysts who have tracked the program since its 2016 launch, is neither triumph nor collapse. Vision 2030 remade Saudi Arabia's labor market and built credible new industries in tourism, sport, and pilgrimage logistics, while falling well short of its most ambitious construction and diversification targets. Two things, both true, sitting uncomfortably next to each other, much like almost everything else this kingdom has ever built. Officials now describe the years from 2026 to 2030 as a phase of accelerated implementation, language that, translated out of the press release, means narrower scope, harder financial gates, and far more scrutiny before anything new gets built. The kingdom that once announced glass cities taller than any building on Earth is now the kingdom quietly explaining, one paused project at a time, which of those cities it can actually afford to finish. The plan's real audience was never entirely foreign, in the end. More than 60% of the roughly 34 million people living in the kingdom are under the age of 35, a generation with no adult memory of the oil shock era their grandparents survived, and every expectation of being able to watch a film, hold a passport, or take a job their mothers were never permitted to hold. Somewhere in the eastern province, not far from where a modern refinery now processes more oil in a single day than most of the world consumed in an entire year, when Khamis bin Rimthan was a young man, the original Dammam well number 7 still stands. Aramco preserved it, mounted its second wellhead on a pedestal, turned the site into a small museum where employees sometimes stopped to take a photograph in front of the rusted derrick that started everything the kingdom would become. Rimthan himself is buried somewhere in that same province, in a grave far less visited and marked far less permanently than the oil field and the supercomputer that now carry his name. None of this makes Saudi Arabia unique in wanting control over its own story. Every government edits what it shows the world. What makes this kingdom different is the sheer scale of what it has had to manage at once. The largest independently verified oil wealth on the planet, the 2 cities every Muslim on earth is obligated to try to reach at least once, a foreign labor force larger than the population of most nations, and a neighborhood that in the spring of 2026 made abundantly clear that no amount of money fully insulates a country from where it happens to sit on a map. He found the kingdom's first great secret using nothing but the color of the sand and a lifetime spent paying close attention. Everything that came after, the wells, the mosques, closed to outsiders, the guardianship decrees lifted one careful year at a time, the cinema doors reopened after 35 years shut, the tombs pulled out of 2,000 years of silence, the migrant graves that most of the world will never learn the names of, the missiles that finally showed everyone exactly how exposed all that wealth really was, sits on the same principle Rimthan understood by instinct, and that the kingdom has spent over a century practicing on purpose. The desert doesn't give up its secrets. It decides who gets to keep them. Tonight, somewhere in the empty quarter, the wind is doing what it has always done, sliding grains of sand from one dune face to another, erasing whatever tracks were left there by morning, keeping its own quiet account of what passed through, and choosing, once again, not to show anyone at all. Somewhere under all of it, the oil keeps flowing, the pilgrims keep circling, the cranes keep rising over projects that may or may not finish on schedule, and a country that built itself on knowing exactly what to reveal and exactly what to bury keeps doing, tonight, precisely what it has always done. If this journey moved you, consider subscribing. See you on the next road.